Okay, when the Snyder Cut was released a few weeks ago, it opened my eyes to the war between the DC and Marvel fan base. And I say opened my eyes because I knew it existed, everybody does, but I didn't care about it. I have watched every single Marvel and DC movie that's been released in the last 20 years because I like sci-fi and fantasy stuff. I don't really care where it's coming from. But apparently, some people do care. And by some people, I definitely just mean DC fans. Not people that like DC, people that only like DC. So I wanted to write this little love letter to them and show that it's actually great for DC when Marvel succeeds, and vice versa. We're going to do so in the form of the past, present, and future, meaning how did all of this start, where's the rivalry or market now, and where is it headed in the future? And let's start with the past. The market for superhero movies that exist today does so for multiple reasons because of DC. Unequivocal fact, they started the comic book craze in the 30s and 40s, and the company now known as Marvel was started because they wanted a piece of the pie. Particularly during the Great Depression, comic books were a cheap form of reading and also, as we all know, escapism to how shitty life can be and was during that time. Other comic book companies existed, but these two are the only ones that matter here. They're the ones that survived this long. So DC founded it, and a little free market education. What happens when a new industry is created is generally the founding company has great success for a while doing what they originally started. And then a second company comes in and piggybacks off their foundation, usually innovating in enough ways to take the market over. This is what Steve Jobs did, right? He never built shit. He gathered what other people made, figured out how to make it better, how to market it, and thus has a $1 trillion company. That's what Marvel did to DC. And over the years, they each had their heyday. Marvel would take over for a while and then coast on their success. Then DC would be forced to innovate and take the first spot back over. The innovations brought us amazing characters and storylines that are still used today. For instance, one of DC's innovations by 1940 standards, was to create Wonder Woman and introduce more diversity into their stories. One of Marvel's was to say F you to the governing body that comic book companies used to submit their comics to for approval. They instead broke off and created their own rating system so parents would know what kind of material was in the comic books. And in hindsight, these things might seem like obvious moves, but they were moves that might not have ever happened if they didn't have competition pushing them. Now, if you fast forward like 60 years, you get to the early 2000s and the transition into the modern market. Almost done with the history lesson, but throughout the 90s and early 2000s, both Marvel and DC had their one-trick ponies. Batman had been the go-to recycled character of DC since Tim Burton's Batman in '89. And in '02, the Spider-Man movie marathon started as we got way too many Spider-Man movies, way too fast. Then we got another round of recycled characters, but it worked out this time in Christopher Nolan's absolute blessing of a trilogy that was bestowed upon us before Marvel did what happens in rivalry markets, and they innovated. They started the trend of not recycling characters with new actors, but in creating a timeline years ahead of schedule that showed the audience what was to come if they would be loyal and show up to the box office. And it was a lot. They announced movies 10 years ahead of time. I remember when the announcements came out and I was like, why the hell do I care about movies coming out in 2015? That is a lifetime away. But turns out that it went pretty quick. And all this leads up to the market that exists today. Marvel was through phase 1 of their cinematic universe when the Dark Knight trilogy ended. Not that big of a deal. DC adapted, turned around, and announced the DCEU. Interweaving storylines, movies 10 years in advance, and all that. But their movies have not been received critically or commercially as well as Marvel's. And let me be very clear about this to all the people that are going to bitch and moan in the comments. It's not that these DC movies are bad. They're good. But good doesn't cut it when the competition is bringing in $1 billion a movie. That's an insane number for a movie, and DC has shown that they can produce that, but they haven't been able to produce it at the same rate, and that's the issue. Because when one movie in their 10-year plan flops, they're forced to rebrand, and a rebrand is not an innovation. It's 2 steps back and 1 step forward. It's why we're getting another rebranded Batman and another rebranded Suicide Squad, 2 Jokers in the same year, not even remotely associated. Even if some of those are Oscar-worthy, it makes it feel like DC isn't innovating, and they're just following their previous success model of reusing characters because they know the audience will show up to the box office. And while DC is doing that one-trick pony act, Marvel is not taking their foot off the pedal. R-rated movies, another expanded universe, selling to Disney and putting out some of the highest-rated TV currently airing, they're making moves. All of this is to say that in the current market, Marvel is ahead. By a lot, and I'm not saying that to be divisive, I'm saying it because it's what the numbers show. And this brings us into the future segment of this video. Marvel being ahead right now should not anger or upset you as fans of DC. It should excite you. The day is coming soon when DC will be forced to try harder, innovate better in order to regain the first spot, the spot that they founded in the first place. What that means for the audience is that you get better content, more content, content that changes the game and hasn't been done before. The point of all of this is not to say which one is better. It doesn't matter. These franchises have traded first place 24 times in the past 80 years. Sometimes it takes decades to switch places, but the switch always happens. You can be fans of both, and you should be. And I even think if you're standing on one side of the fence or the other, you should almost encourage the rivalry, respectfully, because it means better content gets made for both sides. Now, part of that means not sticking up for the franchise when they make something subpar. Let them know you expected more so they can know to change it. Some very brave souls stuck up for Batman and Robin back in the day, but enough time has passed that even George Clooney can admit it was complete shit. That's fine. Not every movie has to be a banger because the company you love produced it. Personally, I didn't like the Snyder Cut, and I'm not a Marvel-loving troll for saying that. I didn't think it was good, but hey man, guess what else? I also thought the Fantastic Four was complete shit. Both of them. I thought Venom was garbage. In fact, Marvel has had a laundry list of completely shit movies over the last 20 years, and in the immortal words of Mallory Archer, I'd rather put a shotgun in my mouth and pull the trigger with my toes than watch any of them. So I'm not pro Marvel or pro DC. I'm pro good content. I'm a fan of both. I think that the pseudo rivalry, and I say pseudo because Marvel and DC get along quite well actually and have for decades. They just play it up for the public to increase ticket sales. I think the rivalry is good. It encourages better content. People just need to be a little more articulate in their arguments rather than review bombing a movie that doesn't have anything to even do with DC. So that wraps that up. Lastly, I want to point out my most anticipated superhero movie that's announced. I have cried every time that they have announced that Robert Pattinson's Batman has been delayed. I think that the movie is an incredible step in the right direction for the company, and I just hope that they expand on it. Partly because I'm tired of seeing the recycled characters every few years, and partly because I think Pattinson will just murder that role. If you can overlook Twilight, he is a damn good actor. So let me know in the comments what your most anticipated movie is, and let's send this off with the traditional Native American war dance so famous in Philadelphia. See you next week.
Gentlemen, suck my dick.